Now, for our first topic, I want to talk about something that's coming from the esports space, which is very near and dear to my heart. Many of you listening to this podcast know that I have been in the esports space for the last 10 years of my life. I love esports and the industry and everything that it has done for fans of video games, for players, for people who are trying to get into the video game industry. And what's happened as of the past, I'd say couple months, the last 6 months at the most, is we've been seeing a lot of scaling back, a lot of esports power heads really kind of dying off or not, achieving the growth that you would normally see, right? A good example is Phase being not profitable and finding that out through going on the stock market. Esports teams spending just outrageous amounts of money in different areas. And, while that's always been happening, um, esports has really been one of those industries and those areas of culture that has not particularly changed from the way it's been over the last, let's say, 10 to 13 years. Well, some really interesting news came out yesterday concerning the esports organization known as the Guard. Now, first off, the Guard is owned by Kroenke Sports and Entertainment. If you don't recognize that name, it's owned by Stan Kroenke, the owner of the LA Rams, the Denver Nuggets, Colorado Avalanche, and on top of that, some others like Arsenal VC, SoFi Stadium, all sorts of different brands on top of that. And what came out is that the Guard has essentially laid off all of its content, social, and creative teams. Now, I want to read this article from Esports from Jessica Schnarnagel, and she basically says this. The Guard, an esports organization with many teams and some of the most prominent esports, have seemingly laid off every single employee on its content, social, talent, and creative teams. Multiple people within the company are reporting. The news was made public by one of the organization's apparel designers who tweeted that everyone's position at the Guard had been eliminated. A few minutes later, a media personality for the Guard also tweeted there had been mass layoffs. This is quite literally crazy to think about because for two reasons. One, this sent a flurry through the esports industry last night. A lot of people, again, I mean, dozens, if not potentially, hundreds of people losing their jobs overnight. There were some people who literally were moving to LA to go work for the Guard who now are stuck in a really very interesting position, and on top of that, this is an organization that did very, very well for itself, right? It had multiple teams across several esports titles like Overwatch, Apex, Valorant, the Call of Duty League. This Valorant team had won Stage 1 challengers in the Valorant Championship tournament last year. They finished top 8 in Valorant Masters. The LA Gladiators, which is their Overwatch franchise, finished first in several tournaments last year. The LA Gorillas, which is their Call of Duty franchise, won a major last year. So it's really intriguing to see what happened. But then, and we got the news as well from Esports today, Scott Robertson reporting this, that Kroenke Sports and Entertainment is looking for a suitable buyer for both the LA Gladiators and the Los Angeles Gorillas. Basically, these teams will only remain operational underneath the company, given that these layoffs happen, which I think is kind of crazy. And the reason why they're remaining operational basically is, again, so a suitable buyer can be found for the teams or the franchise slots themselves, or until the season ends for each of these teams. If a buyer is not found, then these teams are going to be shut down, which is just absolutely crazy to hear about, right? I think it's really saddening to see what's happened. Especially if you look at the way that the Overwatch League and the CDL came to be with, esports competitions and things like that, we've seen a lot of changing hands with ownerships of franchises. We've seen a lot of teams struggle to really justify keeping it around, to really justify being in the space, right? If you look at it, LA Thieves, which is owned by 100 Thieves, they previously purchased the Call of Duty LA slot from Immortals back in the 2021 year. And that itself was a really big thing. You look at when Optic Gaming and Envy merged, they bought the slot previously owned by NRG, and all that. They and then eventually that slot became open to Robert Kraft and Oxygen Esports. You look at the Overwatch League when, for instance, like when Optic was bought by Immortals back in 2019, I believe it was. It took them like 8 or 9 months to sell off the Houston Outlaws, and it was a really interesting thing. So I mean, these franchise spots go for tens of millions of dollars, and it's kind of saddening to see that this is happening. Again, I feel bad for everyone at the Guard, everyone at the LA Gorillas, everyone at um, as well. The other brand, that being the LA Gladiators, because what this means is an entire um big player in the esports space is backing out. And some people are really wondering what this means for the future of esports. I don't know. I think what this says is a lot of problems for esports, right? Because when big ownership groups like this that have tens of millions of dollars are leaving the space in droves, it really begs the question: is esports dying? Have we hit sort of this growth slump, and that people don't see it justifiable anymore to keep these spots around, right? If they're not necessarily generating money, or they're breaking even, or it's just a strategy change, no one really knows what's happening. I will certainly do my best to keep you guys updated with that, but certainly really saddening news to hear the most. All right. Now, before we get into our second topic for this episode, I want to talk about a sponsor of the podcast, that being Zencastr. Zencastr is the ultimate all-in-one podcasting platform. It bundles all your podcasting needs, from recording, editing, distribution, and monetization, all from the same place. It allows you to record in 16-bit audio with up to 4K studio video quality. It is a really amazing tool. I use it for the podcast. I'm actually an investor in the company, and I really love what this company does. They are used by some of the biggest players in the media space, in the finance space, all sorts of different ways. So it's never been easier to create a podcast than doing it through Zencastr. If you want to, sign up for free at zencastr.com. That is zencastr.com. All right. Now, that being said, let's get to our second topic. And this is something that crossed my radar. Someone actually sent this to me a couple days ago. And that has to do with Spotify and its podcasting department, because it seems that Spotify is in a really interesting time right now. Apparently, the old guard at the podcasting side of Spotify is taking a hit, right? Earlier this month, it was reported that Don Ostroff, who had been a very crucial member of the Spotify, board, right, as the chief content and advertising officer, was departing the company, as well as Spotify cutting 6% of its workforce. But also, we are getting the news today that Max Cutler, who oversaw content partnerships for Spotify, is also leaving as well, right? This is kind of crazy. He actually did a lot for Spotify in the last couple of years, right? He founded the horror and true crime podcast studio, Parcast, which Spotify bought back in 2019 for $55 million. He moved up the ranks to be the head of new content initiatives, and then became the head of talk creator content and partnerships. And it's kind of crazy to see this happening, right? He's not being fired or laid off, but it is certainly really interesting to see what has happened since then. Right now, like I mentioned, the vertical at Spotify for podcasts is going through a major restructure, right? If you think about it, people like Don Ostroff spent hundreds of millions of dollars on exclusives like Batman Unburied, the Joe Rogan Experience, and so forth and so forth, which have done well and haven't done well at the same time. And so I find this very intriguing, right? As someone who is in the podcast space, Spotify has had sort of this, neck and neck grip with YouTube over podcasts. I think it's very interesting to see what is going to happen from here. Now they have said that once Max Cutler leaves in May, so he's not leaving immediately, but he is departing very soon. I think it's mainly to do with the transition of things. Basically, there will be different people who will be taking on his responsibilities and things like that. Which I think is quite shocking to say the least. There will be no layoffs with his departure in the company. So I think that's at least one thing that's great, not having any more layoffs because of someone wanting to leave the company. But it's certainly really interesting to see what happens here, right? Again, I think it's very interesting to just see that podcasts who or Spotify really, sorry, who has been one of the biggest players, is really trying to find itself. I think that one of the biggest problems with Spotify right now, besides podcasts, is they keep touting for so many years that they're going to have a Spotify Hi-Fi. I know that they've created it, but they've not really been deploying it, which I think is also making a lot of uh audio listeners not want to stick around on Spotify. Like I myself, I actually use Tidal and Google Podcasts for music and listening to podcasts more than I probably do Spotify itself. So I think that that's a really big thing. And it also goes to the fact that a lot of these acquisitions they've made, Chartable, Megaphone, Podsites, Anchor, they're still trying to find a way to make these work in harmony, because these are all different stacks according to one anonymous employee who used to work at Spotify. So I think that that's very intriguing to see, what happens from here. What I want to know from you guys though on social media is, what do you guys think? Do you think Spotify, sorry, is at a really critical point in its history? Do you think that it is struggling to really keep up its dominance? What do you think is going to happen? Let me know in the comments down below. All right. Now, with that being said, let's get into our third topic for this, and that is going to be some really interesting news coming around the BBC, because some really interesting news is being reported by Deadline today that Richard Sharp, who is the chair of the BBC, has been urged to resign and is planning to resign, after basically being urged to by almost 1,000 respondents at a staff survey in the company. This is because he was found to have basically been in different investigations over giving loans to former prime ministers and things like that. So I think that that's really kind of intriguing. I think that this will certainly be something that we'll want to keep a little bit of a look on. Right now there's a lot of interesting things that are happening in the media space. A lot of people, being forced out, a lot of people who are departing, a lot of layoffs happening, like I just mentioned. So it is very, very interesting. Um, and I look forward to seeing what happens with the BBC, moving forward from this. Um, certainly a lot of really interesting things are happening on that front. So, with that being said, guys, before we get into our next topic, I want to talk about another sponsor of the podcast, that being One More. One More is an award-winning professional audio brand that is dedicated and committed to bringing consumers high-end audio solutions with studio-quality sound, delicate designs, and an excellent build quality. Whether you are a music lover that is young or old, fluent or affluent, you deserve to hear music as it was meant to be heard, as the artist intended it to be heard. I myself have a lot of the products from One More. I've been a big believer in the company for so many years. They provide some of the most amazing earbuds and earphones and other types of technology out there. And if you're someone, again, who really loves listening to music the way it was meant to be heard, I definitely suggest getting One More. So definitely go to onemore.com or click the link in the show notes. And with that being said, guys, let's get into our next topic. And our next topic that I want to talk about is some really interesting news around the creators of Dark, which I think is really interesting. So, if you guys know, Baran Bo Odar and John T. Freeze, they created the show way back in the day, called Dark, which was, Netflix's first European series. Was a splash hit. They recently did 1899, which was a big budget drama that got unfortunately canceled. But the news has come out from Deadline today that Netflix has re-upped a deal with the duo for a 8-figure pact. The first one that they're doing is a comic book adaptation of Something is Killing the Children, which I think is really interesting. A lot of people believe that this has echoes of Dark in it. They're saying that the series alights a small town plagued by monsters and all these sorts of different things. So I think that that's very interesting, and they also plan on doing some other stuff as well. One of the things I'm also hearing, and that Deadline has also reported on this, is that they're going to be working more closely with Netflix's Peter Friedlander and Bella Baggiario's U.S. and global TV teams with more English language projects, which I think is going to be really interesting. And it'll be kind of interesting to see what happens here. I think that this will create more high end content for Netflix at a time when so much of its content is being canceled. These are people, again, Baran and Jonty, who are fantastic creatives in the entertainment space. When they made Dark, when they made 1899, when they've made other projects, people flock in droves to it. The only question I have is, will Netflix commit to long term with this duo? Because, like I mentioned, a lot of shows from Netflix over the last year or two have been getting canceled in droves after 1 or 2 seasons. A lot of people thought 1899 was going to get renewed, and it didn't. So who knows what's going to happen? I want to leave it up to you guys on social media. What do you guys think is going to happen? And we'll go from there. And for our final topic of this episode, I have some really interesting news coming out of the business and finance space, but it also has a little bit of a hint of media in there. And that being that the founder of Aussie Media, Carlos Watson, according to both the Hollywood Reporter, Deadline, and other outlets, is being arrested on federal fraud charges. This is something that it has kind of been really crazy and something that I've had my eyes on for quite some time, and I've had a few other people bringing to my attention. Basically, for those that don't know, Aussie Media was a digital media company created by former CNN and MSNBC anchor Carlos Watson. Basically, last year they had been going through a whole reckoning where the company's COO resigned after finding out that he impersonated a YouTube executive in a fundraising meeting with Goldman Sachs. On top of that, their chairman Mark Lazary left last year, and a lot of people as well thought that Aussie Media was going to potentially shut down. Then eventually it was going to be resurrected or sometime this year. But according to the Hollywood Reporter, like I mentioned, Carlos Watson, the founder and CEO of Aussie Media, has been arrested on fraud charges. Samir Rao, who was that individual who impersonated, a unnamed YouTube executive, also recently pleaded guilty to fraud charges and agreed to cooperate with federal investigations. Um, and they're being charged, Watson, Ozzy, and I assume most likely some others, with defrauding investors of over $50 million. And it is quite crazy. Now, to kind of give an idea as to how extensive this fraud was, um, a copy of the criminal charges state that Watson, Rao, and other executives engaged in a scheme to, quote, defraud Ozzy's investors, potential acquirers, lenders, and also potential lenders through material misrepresentations and omissions about, among other things, their historical and projected financial results, debts, audience numbers, the identities of investors and the size of their investments, the existence and timing of investment rounds, the identity of business partners, and as well the existence of key contracts and the terms of those contracts, along with purported offers to purchase Aussie by other high profile corporations. So that is quite literally crazy to think about, right? The fact that, again, this company had been down for quite some time in the TV and the podcast space, and ultimately, I think that this is really kind of crazy. I believe, from what I understand, Ozzy was in talks to sell itself to a digital media publisher for $225 million. He had said that at one point in time he was in talks with BuzzFeed. So it is really interesting to see what happens there. But ultimately, it will be very interesting to see what happens in this scenario, right? I'd love to know what you guys think about this on social media. Again, myself, I'm kind of intrigued by this. I think that this shows that there's still just a lot of behind the scenes shadiness that goes on in the media space, and who knows what will happen from here. I definitely see some jail time being in this, because again, they have this case um basically looking open and shut, right? Impersonations and all the different types of things that have happened. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. Let me know what you guys think on social media or in the show comments and so forth. All right. With that being said, guys, this is the end of the podcast. Hopefully, you did enjoy this episode. If you guys did enjoy the episode, thank you so much for making all the way to it. And make sure to share this with your family, friends, whoever. Leave a like if you did enjoy the episode of this podcast. We're going to be bringing a ton of guests on the podcast. We got a ton of news that is coming out that I hopefully will have for you over the weekend and things like that. So definitely a lot for you guys. And with that being said, if you want to follow the podcast on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok is Talk of Town Pod. With that being said, we will see all of you in the next one.